In tonight's news edition, His Majesty the King holds talks with British leaders on the repercussions of the Syrian crisis on Jordan and Palestinian-Israeli peace. The Prime Minister briefs professional association and political party leaders on his government's plans and pledges to reach out to civil society institutions. And as the world marks World Refugee Day, the UN High Commissioner for Refugee calls for UN support to Jordan. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty the King and British Prime Minister David Cameron held talks in London on developments in the Middle East. The Syrian crisis, efforts to resume peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis, and Jordanian-UK ties were high on the agenda. Khal has more on the talks.
The Syrian crisis, efforts to resume peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis, and Anglo-Jordanian ties were high on the talks His Majesty held with British Prime Minister David Cameron. His Majesty pointed out that his talks with Cameron today are part of coordination between the two countries.
Prime Minister, again, it's a pleasure to be back, and thank you very much for not only your friendship that you've shown Jordan, but also the commitment of your government and the British people for the tremendous challenges that we're facing, especially with the issue of the refugees. And again, beyond the call of duty as always, I think your country has come through, and we appreciate. I followed obviously the G8 very closely, and I know that that extra effort that you and your government have gone to alleviate the suffering of not only the Syrian refugees but also the burden that Jordan is going through.
The two leaders touched upon efforts to end the stalemate in the peace process and help Palestinians and Israelis to resume direct talks to solve all final status issues and establish an independent Palestinian state. King Abdullah reiterated Jordan's stance of the need to find a transitional comprehensive political solution for the Syrian crisis, pointing to the huge burden shouldered by Jordan for hosting more than 500,000 refugees in the country. His Majesty praised the British assistance to Jordan in this field, calling on the international community to increase the volume of assistance to the kingdom to be able to provide relief services to the refugees. King Abdullah touched upon the comprehensive reform process which Jordan is pursuing to cement the democratic approach and develop political life. The British Prime Minister announced that his country will provide Jordan with additional £50 million to enable the country to cope with the refugee problem. He pointed to the huge pressure imposed by Syrian refugees on regional countries.
Britain and Jordan have very close relations. We work very closely together. And obviously we can discuss today the crisis in Syria. And I know the enormous pressure that is putting on all countries in the region. We had the G8 over the last 2 days where we agreed extra humanitarian aid that I know will help. But really we need to deal with the cause of the crisis and reach a political solution. So I'm really pleased to have you here, Your Majesty, so we can discuss what steps we can further take to bring this to a close.
His Majesty also held similar talks with British Foreign Secretary William Hague on the regional situation, especially Syria, and international issues of common concern. In a meeting with committees at the British House of Lords and the House of Commons, King Abdullah reiterated Jordan's stance on the Syrian crisis and the refugees' exodus into Jordan, home to more than 500,000 displaced Syrians. The King briefed the British lawmakers on efforts to bring about peace and end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict based on the two-state solution. The King told the Parliament members that the 2020 Arab Peace Initiative is a historic opportunity to achieve comprehensive peace in the Middle East. On bilateral ties, the King said Jordan and Britain had maintained deep historical ties, especially in the parliamentary field. The British lawmakers also reiterated their country's desire for forging closer cooperation with Jordan and to help it overcome strains resulting from the huge number of refugees on its territory. Khal for the news at 10.
His Royal Highness Prince Faisal bin al-Hussein, the Regent, welcomed Norwegian Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide and UN High Commissioner for Refugees Antonio Guterres for talks on the Syrian crisis and its impact on the kingdom. The Prince spoke about the burdens Jordan had to suffer by hosting more than 500,000 Syrian refugees who had taken refuge in the country. He also urged the international community to continue its support for the kingdom to continue providing services for the refugees. The region praised the assistance provided by international organizations and UN agencies to refugee hosts, calling for more concerted efforts and coordination among them. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour also discussed with the Norwegian Foreign Minister the ramifications of the Syrian crisis on the kingdom. Mansour briefed the minister, who is visiting to check on conditions of Syrian refugees, on the burdens posed to Jordan by hosting more than 500,000 Syrian refugees. He urged the international community to continue support for Jordan to help it provide services for the refugees. Mansour said Jordan backed a political solution to the Syrian crisis and voted hope that an upcoming conference in Geneva will help restore stability and end the bloodshed in Syria. Talks also touched on efforts to breathe new life into the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, where the Prime Minister praised Norway's support of the Palestinian people. He said Jordan stands behind any effort to achieve peace based on the two-state solution. His Royal Highness Prince Faisal bin al-Hussein, the Regent, received a delegation from the US-based National Democratic Institute, which supports democratic institutions and practices throughout the world. Discussions focused on the latest regional developments and challenges. The Prince reviewed Jordan's stance in support of efforts to achieve peace and end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict based on the two-state solution. He also spoke about the need to find a political solution to the Syrian crisis. Prince Faisal briefed the team on Jordan's achievements along the path of reform, citing the newly established Constitutional Court and Independent Elections Commission as democratic institutions and a product of the reform process. Members of the delegation, led by former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, praised the advanced level of reforms made by Jordan as a model in the region. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour briefed the former US Secretary of State on steps Jordan had adopted to enhance democracy, freedoms, human rights, and the political party's increased role in the nation's political life. He also pointed to preparations to hold municipal elections in August. Mansour thanked the US for the support it provides to Jordan to help it press ahead with development programs. Albright hailed the historic friendship between Jordan and the US and commended the reforms which she said turned Jordan into a regional model. She also noted that the kingdom is host to a large number of Syrian refugees despite economic hardship. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour held meetings with presidents of professional and labor associations and secretaries general of political parties. The encounters are part of periodic meetings between the government and civil society institutions to discuss domestic issues. Mansour said his government will be turned to civil society institutions and open to thoughts, calling them the conscience of the people and a key partner in the kingdom's modernization and development scheme. The Prime Minister said decision-making and formulating positions and convictions is a collective endeavour, as all citizens share the same concerns and uphold the national interest. Speaking on the economy and a deficit-stricken budget, Mansour said the government is moving to make a quantum leap, noting that unemployment is the biggest woe and will be addressed through implementation of capital projects for which 1,200 million dinars have been allocated in this year's budget, which was passed by the lower house this week. Mansour said external and internal debt had hit $20 billion, adding that a key concern is the heavily indebted electricity sector, which incurs an estimated annual loss of 1,200 million dinars. He said authorities had begun an energy conservation scheme in all state agencies and are dealing with a 100 million dinar technical loss and stealing of the grid. He told the union and party leaders that the household sector will be exempted from an electricity tariff raise this year, but house bills over 50 dinars will be subject to a 15% price hike next year. The Ministry of Awqaf and Islamic Affairs has agreed with the Queen Alia International Airport Management to build a mosque holding 400 worshippers. The call to prayer, the adhan, will also beam from the airport premises as of tomorrow. Awqaf Minister Muhammad Liqda said the airport group, which built the new terminal, will ensure that workers and passengers can perform religious rites. As the international community marks World Refugee Day, officials are racing against the clock due to the vast scale of the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan. Northeastern of the country faces hard conditions in helping to build what will become the country's largest refugee camp. Officials say the international community must put all efforts behind a negotiated solution to the crisis through peace talks and a cessation of hostilities. Hibatum has more on the refugees' condition.
High Commissioner for Refugees Antonio Guterres called upon the UN and its affiliate organizations to support Jordan to assure it remains a pillar of security and stability in the region. In a meeting with Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour, Guterres commended the kingdom's humanitarian role towards Syrian refugees by providing them with basic services, stressing the need to support the kingdom's efforts in this humanitarian task. Mansour touched upon repercussions of the situation in Syria and its humanitarian impact on the kingdom, saying international assistance is not enough to cover even a small part of the services to the displaced Syrians. Guterres has paid a visit to the kingdom's border, where he spoke with Jordanian border patrol officers as well as newly arrived Syrian families. Guterres warned that the Syrian crisis posed a threat unmatched since the Cold War, adding that the only solution for the problem was a political solution.
This war in Syria is becoming a big threat to the peace and stability in this region. And I think it's very important that the world unites in supporting the countries like Jordan, like Lebanon, like Turkey, like Iraq that are receiving these refugees, and that the international community understands that everything must be done to stop this fighting before it is too late.
Andrew Harper, UNHCR's representative to Jordan, said they were currently funded at 30%, but in order to continue providing basic needs for the Syrians, he added that hundreds of millions of dollars were needed.
There's probably about 120 to 130,000 Syrians who have fled the violence in Syria and are now in Zatri camp. That means there's 120,000 people, mainly women and children, who we have to provide shelter for, food, water, medical facilities, education.
During a visit to the Zatri refugee camp in northern Jordan, Hollywood actress and UN Refugee Agency Special Envoy Angelina Jolie called on world leaders to find a resolution to the Syrian conflict. Jolie, accompanied by Guterres, met refugees and listened to the stories of the people who fled Syria.
1.6 million people have poured out of Syria with nothing but the clothes on their back, and more than half of them are children. They have left behind a country in which millions of people are displaced, suffering hunger, deprivation, and fear.
In a message on World Refugee Day, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon pointed that the number of refugees worldwide is at its highest in 20 years, with the Syrian conflict being the main cause behind this drastic increase. Ban called on the international community to intensify efforts to prevent and resolve conflicts and to help achieve peace and security. Refugees in the kingdom are not great places to raise children, but they are definitely still better than the bombed-out towns and insecurity Syrian provinces. As we mark World Refugee Day, it is important to remember that those who have fled terror to the safety of a refugee camp are people with families, lives, and dreams. Without international assistance, the aid agencies, local people, and the governments of Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq will soon be overwhelmed. Hibal Atoum for the News at 10.
And over to Syria. Syrian opposition forces are trying to stem an attempt by President Bashar al-Assad's forces to drive them out of the northern city of Aleppo, as well as the outskirts of the capital, Damascus. Government forces are advancing on the Damascus district of Sayyida Zainab. Rebels besieged in the outskirts of Damascus say the regime is also advancing on the Marj area and has taken several towns in a critical part of the rebel base. In the north, rebels engaged in gunfights as they came under shelling from government artillery in Aleppo. Rebels are pinning their hopes on an anticipated influx of weapons. Neighboring Iraq and Lebanon are warning of the civil war in Syria turning into a regional conflict.
In the most difficult position vis-à-vis this.
A United Nations human rights body accused Israel forces of mistreating Palestinian children, including by torturing those in custody and using others as human shields. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child said Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are routinely denied registration of their birth and access to health care, decent schools and clean water. The report came as European Union Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton met Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank city of Ramallah in a bid to revive peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. Ashton also discussed with Palestinian Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah political and economical issues in the Palestinian territories. Hamdallah said he hoped U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry's visit to the region next week will help revive the peace process.
The opportunity to talk with you about the current situation, to talk about the importance that the European Union attaches to continuing to offer you the economic support that is so necessary, and to, of course, continue in our efforts to support the peace process, a two-state solution, and to reaffirm our commitment to you in that context.
Ashton later met Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and will visit the Gaza Strip, where she will meet UNRWA Commissioner General Filippo Grandi.
Tested by whether Iran changes its policy.
Just 2 weeks after taking office, Palestinian Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah has offered his resignation to President Mahmoud Abbas. It was not immediately clear whether Abbas would accept the resignation by Hamdallah, an academic and political independent whose cabinet only met for the first time last week. His predecessor, Salam Fayyad, resigned in April after 6 years in power, defined by tough economic challenges and rivalries with Fatah politicians. In an extraordinary comeback, the Miami Heat beat the San Antonio Spurs 103-100 in overtime to force a decisive 7th game in the National Basketball Association Finals. Miami were 13 points behind, but managed to level the score seconds before the end of the third quarter and forced overtime. LeBron James had a game-high 32 points for the Heat, while Mario Chalmers had 20. Tim Duncan had 30 points for the Spurs.
Green trying to get free. Cross-court pass to Green. Green blocked by Bosch. Game over. There'll be a game set.
In a 7-goal thriller, Italy clawed back a 2-goal deficit to win 4-3 and overcome a powerful Japan to reach the Confederations Cup semi-finals. Japan took the lead with a penalty from Kisuke Honda in the 21st minute. Shinji Kagawa doubled the lead for Japan in the 33rd after a defensive error. Daniele De Rossi pulled one back with a header in the 41st minute. Japan's defender Yoshida made a terrible mistake deflecting a pass into Kawashima's net 5 minutes after the second half kicked off. And only 2 minutes later, Mario Balotelli converted a penalty. Okazaki later equalized for Japan with a header, but Italy's Giovinco scored the winner 7 minutes before the final whistle. On Saturday, Italy will face Brazil, who earlier beat Mexico 2-1. Now for a quick look at the weather forecast. Pleasant weather tonight is expected across many parts of the country with northwesterly moderate winds. Tomorrow, normal summer conditions are in the forecast in hilly areas, but it will be relatively hot to hot in Aqaba and the Jordan Valley. Winds will be northwesterly moderate to brisk, blowing dust in the desert region. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect some moderate weather tonight and hot day tomorrow with northerly winds and seas calm. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now, our top stories once again. His Majesty the King holds talks with British leaders on the repercussions of the Syrian crisis on Jordan and Palestinian-Israeli peace. The Prime Minister briefs professional association and political party leaders on his government's plans and pledges to reach out to civil society institutions. And as the world marks World Refugee Day, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees calls for UN support to Jordan. And that's it for tonight. I'm Rad Labtouche. Thank you for watching. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.